So with environmental factors, that's another major area for the industry study, and it's looking at the impacts of a business having on the environment. So what happens to the environment when that business is running its production processes and everything like that. So the outcomes in it is environmental and sociological considerations, alternative resources, power, material, processes and limitations. So that's the dot point outcome that we cover with this. This will go into more detail, so you don't need to catch that at this point. The very first thing you need to look at is alternative power sources. So this is quite common knowledge now, so you'll find that you will be able to walk into an exam or a test about environmental impacts and things quite well versed in it. We all hear about solar power as an alternative power source, and wind power. That's actually becoming quite debated in the media at the moment. Hydroelectric power. There's also thermal power. So that's where they use the heat of the earth to create steam and run turbines. Not really used a lot in Australia. And also tidal power. So using the tides to, again, move turbines by the upwards and downwards motion. The reason you look at it is you might be trying to meet a green target audience. So if you can say, this is sustainably powered or created, that provides the green target market the reason to buy your product. So it can actually be one of the reasons you sell or go that way to meet that market requirement. There's also the savings made in the power costs. So the school has half the school done in solar, and they said they've already seen a significant drop in the costs. And they're going to complete the rest of the school with solar, which, if you know, it actually feeds a battery, and then the battery takes over when there's no light. So that's how it works. And of course, one of the great reasons for doing this is it's actually sustainable. You're not going to run out of petrol, coal, or however else you're going with the fossil fuels. Now, we also talk about materials. So this is the costs of recycled materials or reused and repurposed materials. The benches in LRC are reused timber that's been put back together again. So if you ever go back in there, have a look at the benches there, and you'll see that it's been repurposed. But we also want to look at those materials being sustainable. So as you can see, if I was talking about this to timber students, this is really obvious how it's going to work with you. With multimedia, you could talk about things like inks for printers. So you know how with printers you buy a printer, you get some ink with it, then when you go purchase ink, it's actually more expensive almost as much as the printer. You can get refillable ink cartridges, so that way you're not throwing away cartridges and you're reusing the ink. And there are actually alternative inks out there as well. So the multimedia materials part is a little loose in how we can connect it. So if you're answering these sorts of questions, I'd be leaning more into the power consumption and those sorts of things. So one of the things is costs of recycled materials can actually be expensive because they've got to process it and remake it. So if you go buy recycled paper, and that's another good one for multimedia, you'll notice that the price of recycled paper is actually more expensive than the non-recycled. There are times though that it's cheaper. So if I talk about, say, an MDF board, which is probably what these desks are made of, that's much cheaper than hardwood. And MDF is compressed sawdust and using offcuts and things. So that's one way of getting around that. But if you can use the sustainable sources, you know that they'll always be available forever. So that sort of gives you certainty in your business because you know that your resources won't run out and the costs won't shift a lot. We can also look at improving our impact on the environment with alternative processes. So when we talk about efficiency of mechanisation and automation, and then also using new technologies, they can reduce waste or pollution and save on costs. So if you produce waste, that's going to have an impact in itself, one on the environment, but also on your need to actually remove that waste. And pollution's obviously got a big negative to it. However, if you go about trying to get these more efficient technologies, there is a cost with it, and that can slow down your production. Initial cost for machines will actually take a big cut out of your profits or your money that you've got, your capital. And then, of course, you've got to do training if you've got new machines for anyone who's working with it. You potentially, obviously, have redundancies for people who no longer have a job because you've replaced them with a machine. So you've got to pay them out, but then retrain a few or hire new people depending on the machines. With the new technologies, I've given examples of electric vehicles and power efficiencies that come with them. You could say that the efficiency of computers and processing in multimedia, because they're becoming faster and require less energy, that in turn is lowering the power consumption of the multimedia industry as well. So there's those sorts of things. Now, there are limitations in alternative energies. It may not meet the power needs of the industry. Now, this is highly unlikely with the multimedia industry, but all the other industries, they're pretty heavy power-based industries with lots of robots and machinery and things like that. And they still go back and push for the fossil fuels power because they need that amount and consistency at this point. It is slowly changing though. So as they're statistically getting the switch over to alternative energies or renewables, we're seeing that it is keeping up with the power requirements of industry. So reused or recycled materials can be inferior in quality, and it is true that they can. They require more work to use successfully, and as they result in that inferior product, it may not be that attractive economically to use at this point in some cases. Recycled paper, most people are happy with that because it performs what it needs to do. But the ultimate limitation on meeting these environmental requirements is the capability of a business to do that. So really businesses are all about, one, staying afloat and making a profit. And if this is going to stop that, they're not going to choose to do it. So they'll need to be sustainable in the long run to be able to do it, and they don't have enough capital to actually do that changeover. So that's one of the issues with it. So recycling and reusing, you need to consider the process of that. So when you go to recycle products, like we've divided our stuff and then we've got to sort that, there's time taken to that, and then you possibly have costs in industry to get the recycled stuff collected. They don't have just your local council garbage collection come and get it. They've got to actually sort out a way of it being collected. So you really balance the costs involved and what are the savings. In savings, quite often it's a long-term one, so it's not an instant hit from the savings that you get from it. And so you have this sort of short-term pain financially to meet these changes, but you have that long-term benefit. Oops. So waste management and minimisation. When you do produce things, you're obviously going to have waste. And when I say things, we're talking about physical products. So we could talk in the multimedia industry about DVDs, so HD DVDs or Blu-rays, and the cases that go with it. All of those things are going to produce waste. So in dealing with that waste, you can't just dump it for obvious reasons. One, it's going to have a major impact on the environment. Two, you'll probably get a penalty for that, and the penalty might start eating into your business being able to keep running. So you minimise that waste with the efficiencies that you apply through whether it's new technologies, mechanisation and automation. So we've talked about these, and you can see how we're starting to link. And that way you can minimise having to get rid of that stuff, and obviously you've got the efficiency benefits. Yep.
So with like big companies like Apple and stuff, if they wanted to just use materials and like it didn't work out and they wanted to use it as like just get rid of it, wouldn't they just have enough money to deal with the penalty?
Yeah, I don't. So Apple being an example being used here, for being able to deal with the penalties and the costs involved with that. It's not a good example because it's a really big company. Like it's it was the biggest company in the world for a long time. So yes, they can afford the penalties. They'll never match the penalties because penalties are legislated for businesses of all types, and they can't make it so it would wipe a business out completely. If they did that, then they could look at knocking down businesses everywhere, and that wouldn't work. So yes, companies like Apple have that advantage of being able to sort of play around the edges, and you could say socially they have as well, in terms of outsourcing to third world countries and stuff like that. So yeah, Apple's not the only company that does that, by the way. We have to look across clothing, all these industries everywhere. Now, pollution is obviously a big issue. A lot of industries create pollution. Multimedia has probably got the least impact of pollution. You could say, yep, we've got waste paper and ink. We use a lot of power, but we're not directly creating the pollution. It's a hard one to fit into the multimedia industry. So again, I always talk about that HD Blu-ray production line. Use that as examples because it's far better to use that. Or you could talk about drones being created because they're commonly used in the multimedia industry. The process of producing these things are going to produce pollution. You could also talk about batteries. So a lot of batteries that we use for rechargeable things like cameras, computers, the drones, all of that equipment, they do eventually die, and there's not easy ways to recycle that, so that does become landfill. So we do have stuff that we go through in multimedia that's pollution. So we have lots of different types. Now, particle pollution, you could bring that down to an industry using vehicles that are using fossil fuels. So, a lot of diesel trucks, well, you can literally see the particle pollution come out of their exhaust pipes. There's chemical pollution. So the byproduct of creating things can end up having chemicals that you've got to get rid of. A good example there would be the lithium in the batteries that we have to dispose of. Like that, eventually the plastic breaks down and then the lithium's released, and that can go into water supplies and so on. There's greenhouse gases, so any process that requires something to burn or heat is going to create carbon dioxide and add to the greenhouse effect. And then there's actually noise pollution. So when you go about putting an industry in an area, and this is why we have zoned areas in various suburbs or cities, if you make too much noise at a certain time and you've got residential areas, that can be considered noise pollution, in which then you have to bring that sound down, and doing that is either not producing at the time, which obviously means you've stopped your production, or refining the production process, and as you can see, both are going to cause a money loss, whether it's not producing or spending all the money to mitigate it. So noise pollution is actually one of those other things, and people even connect the noise pollution to fauna, so animals in the areas too, sometimes. So ultimately, sustainable development is a goal. So to do that, we need to use more efficient processes and technologies. And when you think about the processes and technologies, it is the efficiency of that machines that are being created that we use that helps with that. You could say drones, for instance, using that instead of a full camera crew who have to bring in rails, a crane, multiple people in vehicles to a location. I can tell you that a long time ago, an American production company got in trouble up here in the Blue Mountains because they laid cement in the national park to be able to put dolly rails down. Those sorts of things, the changes over to a drone completely makes that process efficient. You don't need all of that transport, all of that gear, all those people to go and get that shot now. Using recycled material, obviously, will be sustainable because it's recycled. And there's sustainable materials. So when we talk about sustainable materials, an example would be pine, if we're using timber. Okay, so pine is a very fast-growing timber, and if you go out a bit further west, around Lithgow and onwards, you'll see pine forests everywhere. And they've got a 7-year growth cycle, and they just cycle through those pine forests, regrow them, and they never cut down any more trees than the ones they're planting there. There are impacts with that, though. The pine forests themselves do impact on native environments, so it's not like it's perfect, but it's far more sustainable than going and cutting down every tree that's around us and just hoping they'll grow back. You can look at sustainable delivery models. So we talked about the fossil fuels in cars. You could choose to be EV or electronic vehicle only. There are a few companies doing that, and they point out that they're only using electronic vehicles or electric vehicles to move their products, and that's their selling point. And of course, the alternative power sources will make it sustainable because those power sources are never going to go away. There's always going to be wind, there's always going to be sun. Now, when you're looking at the environment, sometimes your company has produced things and over time legislation changes, so you've got to rehabilitate your commercial site, which means you might have to remove things. The classic one is asbestos. So you might have what's considered a contaminant, and you have to rehabilitate the work site to be able to make it functional. They'll actually shut it down if there's too much asbestos in an area. So that's a really good example of a pollutant that wasn't originally considered one, but will affect you in the long run. So there might be things today that we're using in 10 years' time, we might have to change what we're doing or remove it out of the process, or the machines, or the environment where it's going into. So that can come with a great cost. And one of the things when you're looking at developing, whether it's for rehabilitation or even making a new factory, these are the things that are going to make you really consider where you go. So one is land costs and availability. That's the very first thing that makes a decision about where you place your factory or workplace. Transportation facilities to be able to move your products in and out, to get resources into it, to be able to send your products out for sale. The workforce, they've got to be able to access it. The impact on the surrounding population is a consideration. Resource availability, so if you need a lot of water in your production process, then you're going to draw from that area and it needs to be viable. The geographical factors, so sometimes temperatures can have an effect on production processes, and weather and all of those sorts of things. So also the ability to actually cut into those areas, the rocks. And then of course waste management. As you produce waste, is it easy to get rid of? And these are all these considerations for when you're placing it or having an impact on your environment by either developing a new factory or by rehabilitating it. Now, all of this will come under what is considered legislative requirements. So I talked about zones. So you can have an industry zone, a residential zone. Those zones actually do butt up to each other a little bit. Quite often there's a gap. So here we have an industrial zone in our local area. Does anyone know where that is?
Is it in Lawson?
Yeah, in Lawson. That's right. So if you go down the back of Lawson, you'll find there's all these little mini, they're not quite factories, but they're sort of warehouses and things like that. That's outside the residential area. But then you just come up the hill and then you've got residential. So they'd still be impacted by the residents in that area in terms of what they can and can't do. And the council will have said, this is your limitations when they went and built or got their business in there. State government also has them, and so does the federal government. So every one of these governments levels has legislation to do with the environmental impact of a business. Now, Federal's the overriding one, but they don't tend to deal with your local issues. So the council is your local one. But one thing that's federally applied is what's called an environmental impact statement. So if you go to develop a business somewhere else, or a factory or a production facility, you need to do this. And what it is required for new developments and expansions of a development. It looks at the impact on flora and fauna, so plants and animals, and particularly native ones, not your rabbits and weeds, it's native ones. It looks at water and waste runoff mitigation, so what is going to happen when you start collecting more water on the roof? Where's that water going to go? Or you're going to have waste, where's that waste going to be collected and how is it going to be removed safely in the environment? There are some councils that will not let nuclear waste go through their areas. So there's actually nuclear-free councils out there, and you'll see the signs around. So you're not allowed to actually take nuclear waste through it, as an example. You need to measure the impact on community and local infrastructure. So if you start bringing in lots of heavy trucks, imagine coming down Hall Parade here, really heavy vehicles, that's going to have an impact. It's going to have a noise impact. It's going to have an impact on the actual road, and that means it's probably not viable to put something here because it just won't work. You've got to check the development will impact on critical cultural environmental aspects of the area. So this is sort of World Heritage listed area. That's a critical environment. But there's also the cultural one. So in terms of expanding a business, if there's, say, Indigenous Australian rock art in the area, then you're going to have to be very wary about what your production will do to that. Whether it's from vibrations slowly cracking the rocks or the pollution that comes out of the processes and starting to cover it up, all of those things need to be considered as well. So that is how an environmental impact study works. It's going to look at all of that, and you've got to cover it before you get permission to actually go about building it. Interestingly, the Winmalee shopping centre just got in trouble because they didn't actually finish that process. They went and built ahead without the council's permission. Yeah, so they're going to be fined a lot of money.
Is that the new car park?
Not the car park, the actual building.
Oh my god.
Yeah. So, impacts of this. Costs are added to getting permission to develop. Plans may have to be adjusted to satisfy the EIS, which is the Environmental Impact Study, and cost more or may limit what development can occur. So you're getting those costs there. However, it does help make businesses more environmentally friendly and limit that impact that they have and protects the community and the environment in general. So the reason for these is a good rationale. It's there to protect everyone and the environment. Just put that one at the end of there to remind you. You'll note that we've done this, this, and this now. There's only really that to go. And they all interrelate. So you'll notice that when I started talking about environmental impacts and recycling and how you can get efficiency, that sort of lent into here and into here at the same time. You've got to get used to that because you really want to be able to talk about all of these areas as much as possible to show your knowledge in answering the questions. So that's why I put that slide in there at the end. All right.